Be blessed, friend, even as we welcome you to this, your show, Rediscover. Now, you know what we do? We open Scripture, we take exegesis seriously. And then we construct a picture of God that is both inspiring and life-affirming. My name is Miguel Mendez. I am one of the pastors at the Loma Linda University's church. I specialize in spiritual development and study, and it is my great pleasure to partner with LLBN as we embark on this new and exciting adventure called Rediscover. Today we want to continue with our series on the 10 Commandments, those 10 words that God has given in order to create the framework for healthy relationships between each other and with our Creator. If you have a Bible, I'd like you to open it to Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Exodus 20, 13. Do you have it in front of you? Well, good. Now, maybe you've heard this story. Maybe you clicked on it online or you saw it on the television. Maybe you were flipping through a magazine or it was in a newspaper. It's a story that happens all across the nation. It's a story of pain, a story of wonderful promise cut short, a story of violence, a story that undoubtedly has caused many passions to be incensed, a story that demands the quick thought and the response, uncomfortable as it is. We send thoughts and prayers your way. It's a story that also forces us to think about real change. It's a story that we've been dealing with for almost 3 decades. Story of violence in our country. It started several years ago in a sleepy town called Columbine. And 2 young men decided to begin to open fire in their school. And the tragedy and the nightmare has been replicated time and time and time again. And we're left on the sidelines wondering why. Or worse, we've become desensitized to the violence. Recognize that maybe mass shootings are just the price that we have to pay to live in this great nation. That's the temptation, isn't it? To normalize something that ought not to be normal. We all do it. Well, first and foremost, violence is not God's ultimate ideal. Weaponry and war is not God's ultimate design for human beings. Now, the prophets have that clear. Isaiah poetically states it. He dreams a vision, a dream. The idea that one time, when we live under the reign of the Prince of Peace, swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. But what about the here and now? I remember having a conversation with one of my professors. I was taking a class that I didn't particularly like, biblical ethics in the modern world. We were talking about the issue of violence. And the professor was pushing this idea, this dream of a kingdom of peace. And I pushed back and I said, but the reality is here and now. And your dreams seem like pie in the sky that we'll enjoy in the sweet by and by. And he looked at me, and without missing a beat, he said, there's nothing wrong with the sweet by and by. So we have this word, The sixth word, you shall not murder. Now, some translations decide to take the word rasa, the Hebrew, and simply give us this sixth word as you shall not kill. That translation is a bit untenable, since if you've ever read the Old Testament, you certainly are aware of a whole lot of killing. But you also recognize the pull of that teacher, a Galilean master, the one who decided to forego the temptation of violence in order to open the path for reconciliation. You remember his words. As he also is standing atop a mountain, as he also is bringing down a constitution and a covenant for a new nation, as he is also attempting to find ways in which we relate to each other, do you remember his words? You have heard it said, thou shalt not murder, but I say unto you, anyone who is angry at his brother is already guilty of murder. So where do we find the balance? How do we find the path forward? And more importantly, how do we break the cycle of violence? Well, perhaps Mary can help us. Mary lives in Chicago. She had a son. Her son was going to university. He was a brilliant student at Northwestern. His ultimate desire was to become a physician. He was on the honor roll. He was Mary's pride and joy. Mary was also college educated. She was Caucasian. Grew up in an affluent neighborhood. And one night, Mary got the call that every mother dreads. There's been an incident, and your son has been shot. She rushed to the hospital and saw her boy laying on a gurney. A devout Christian, she began to pray. She began to pray that prayer that victims of violence pray. It's a prayer that begins with anguish and ends in anger. It's a prayer that is pregnant with supplication. It's a prayer that demands negotiation. Take me, Lord, don't take him. And after what seemed to be an eternity, a physician walked into the room and said, he's gone. Gone where? Surely this couldn't be. We were making plans. We were filling out applications. We were deciding what medical school he was going to go to. There were so many conversations that were left lingering in the air. Oh, Mary was enraged. She recognized that it would be a while before justice could be served. But a few months later, a police officer called. She said, we have someone in custody. We're getting ready to arraign him and charge him with your son's murder. She went to the court, and for 2.5 weeks she stood behind the young man. When she would catch a glimpse of his face, she always found it interesting how similar he was to her son. Almost same age, almost the same build. Twinkle in their eye, charismatic smile. Except he was African American. He hadn't gone to college, had barely graduated high school. Grew up in another neighborhood, had other plans for his life. Oh, Mary was enraged. But she kept praying that prayer. She kept reminding herself of the words of Jesus, anyone who is angry at his brother is already guilty of murder. She was reminded time and time again of that alternative to the law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Revenge and guilt fighting for her soul. She decided that whatever the outcome of the trial, she was going to talk to that young man. One morning, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. She went back to the cell, looked at the man and felt that anger. She smiled, wept a bit, and left. A few years passed, and Mary continued to wrestle. And then she decided to write a note. It simply read, "You've killed my son. I'd like to talk to you." The response came. The time was arranged. She went to the prison. She saw him. He saw her. She said, "I'm still so angry at you, but I forgive you." Some more time passed. The letters grew longer. The interactions warmer. And then one day the anger was gone. The anger was gone and it was replaced with compassion. Mary was at the young man's first parole hearing, advocating for his release. Under her tutelage, he had graduated from college. Under her tutelage, he had begun to learn of a new way. Under her tutelage, he had rediscovered something within him. Under her tutelage, the viciousness and the vice had been replaced by something else. And so when he was released to Mary's care. He calls her mom now. And she calls him son. Why do I share that story with you? Well, the commandment is often used and misused. You find it quoted on both sides of the political agenda when we're talking about capital punishment. You find it used on both sides of the agenda when we're talking about abortion. You find it politicized and abused. I find it interesting that the word itself, as we've mentioned, that the commandment utilizes to describe this act is simply, "You shall not rasa." And the word could be very well applicable to premeditated as well as accidental murder. It was with this word in mind, by the way, that the ancient Jews had created those cities of refuge, a place where you could go in order to escape the retribution that would come your way if you killed someone accidentally. Rasa is also a word that is used in collaborations with the word goel, which means the avenger. It was the divine right given to someone who had a family member murdered to then go out and exact retribution. I find it interesting. I find it interesting that this sixth word, the commandment, doesn't make the distinction, whether premeditated murder or whether accidental, whether done in order to avenge a wrong committed or not. The word is simply there to remind us that death is not part of God's original intent. Now, sure, I feel the temptation, as do you, to begin to spiritualize the language. To talk about how often we murder each other's character. We stab each other's reputations. We assassinate our hopes or our competitors' dreams. But this sixth word has no space for sentimentality. It is being used to address a society that is every bit as violent as ours. It is being used to address a society where sons rise up against fathers, where nation rise up against nation, where violence seems to be the language that guides discourse in this time and in this place. And it is with that in mind that the word, the commandment, the covenant, this rule that ought to guide the relationship between us and God says, you might kill intentionally or not, but there is something still deeply broken with a reality in which people die. Whether justly or unjustly, whether legally or illegally, when people die, the fabric of the universe is altered. And so you cannot become desensitized to that reality. You cannot simply offer thoughts and prayers. You can't simply retreat to your preferred political positions. You cannot begin to advocate your right to possess weapons that create and inflict destruction. You can't accuse the other side of being intemperate. Because a life has ended. And there is value in life. Thou shalt not kill. And then you might be wondering, and you might be asking, Pastor, but that sounds like pie in the sky, like stuff that we're supposed to consume in the sweet by and by. And I'll tell you, there's nothing wrong with the sweet by and by. There's nothing wrong with the view of swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. And you know why I know that? Because immersed in the cycle of violence as these people were, they still recognized that there was something wrong. The old Hebrew has a word, cherem. The word itself is used exclusively in the context of holy war. Wars of annihilation. Wars in which the enemies of God are rasa, are killed. Wars that are waged in order to grasp that land that God has promised. Wars enacted for the greater good. Wars that Scripture seems to justify. Isn't it true that violence is simply part and parcel of the world we live in? Well, maybe. But consider this. In Jewish culture, after the men came back from war, they were to be excluded from the camp for 7 days. They engaged in this ritual of purification that lasted 7 days. For 7 days, they thought, they wrestled, they prayed, they cried, they hoped, and they wished. Why? Why did they have to bathe and wash away the blood from their hands? Why did they have to purify their swords or their spears? Well, the reason was because war was never the original intent of God's plan. Thou shalt not kill. And perhaps that's why Jesus, thinking about the issue, wrestling with the reality that we are now living in a world where the structures of violence and death are all around us, punctuates his Sermon on the Mount by reminding us of the reality. The reality that which ought to be enfleshed in the lives of every citizen of the kingdom. You have heard that it was said, Matthew 5:21, to the people long ago, do not rasa. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift here in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and give your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, so that he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have given the last penny. You have heard it long ago that it is necessary for us to live in a world where murder is mitigated. But I tell you that it is impossible to fix the cycle of violence in this country unless we begin to analyze what kind of society we have built. You have heard it said, it is necessary for us to legitimize the cycle of violence and to have it under clear rules of engagement. But I say unto you that wars and rumors of wars are social construct created usually by people playing political ploys. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you today that anger leaves everyone blind and toothless. You see, again, the problem when it comes to these words, the words of the covenant, is that we typically begin to associate words with behavior. And the reality is that the covenant isn't only there to regulate your behavior. The covenant is to push us back and to have us recognize that God is interested in dealing not just with the behavior, but with the principles and the attitudes that drive that behavior. And you might still say, but Pastor, that sounds like sweet pie in the sky that we'll eat once we go to the by and by. And Mary will look at you and say, on one cold November morning in Chicago, anger took my son away. But then, 20 years later, on a breezy autumn afternoon, love gave me a son back. You shall not kill. It's not just about behavior. It's about dealing with the instincts that drive us. The Israelites knew that death and violence wasn't the ideal. And so they purified themselves. We know that death and violence isn't the ideal. And so we offer thoughts and prayers. I wonder if it is possible that instead of looking at the behavior, we begin to say, maybe the real secret to turning plows from swords and to building pruning hooks out of spears is to recognize that the Hivite, the Girgashite, the Perishite, the Amalekite, the Philistine are also my brothers. And that man who took something from me is also my brother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill, because we serve a God who loves. May God continue to bless you today.